Hi there, welcome back to another small ramble with me, writer and mental health advocate Tobe Allen, also one half of the BARROW Podcast, the show I do with my mum, where we talk about divorce, dysfunctional families, and mental illness while writing a memoir together. On the latest episode of the BARROW Podcast, we were talking again about The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. This time on the effects of abuse and neglect. We were also talking about relationships and sex. And we were kind of looking again at this sort of period of childhood development that Mum and I are, generally curious about. One of the things we landed on in the episode, or that, I was I was kind of suggesting, is that, the core dysfunction of our family or the culture of our family seemed to be at some level kind of like a sexual dysfunction. What does it mean to have a family that is sexually dysfunctional? And is that even a thing? I don't know. I think that it could be, certainly. And my way of making sense of this has got to do with the kind of cultural attitudes and repression around sex, sexuality, and relationships that existed within our household. Some of that was based on religious influences, but also just growing up in an intergenerational household of people who are from a certain time and place in history, and then on a kind of like an individual level, having their own baggage and kind of stuff that they haven't quite sorted through. It's always been worth noting to me, or something that Mum and I have been kind of scratching around the surface on, of like her relationship with her mother and how that sort of relates to sexual development and maturity, as well as their bodies, their female bodies, their bodies as like a site of presentation, and my grandmother's interference and sort of over possessiveness of my mother's body as she was maturing. Mum has sort of touched on this in past episodes as well, talking about, her mother sort of dressing her up and sort of, dressing her at times a little inappropriately, as well as kind of scolding her for receiving male attention and all sorts of things. So there was always this push-pull between sort of, glorifying people's physical appearance and wanting to sort of control it, but then also pulling back from, retracting, withdrawing from any kind of aspect of sex and sexuality. So there was this kind of odd tension and culture in the household that I grew up in. And, I have always said to Mum that like the root of a lot of the issues with the family is around sex. And if you then take in sort of later developments with regard to, my father, which has been touched on in a previous episode as well, then, that brought up a whole other series of cultural attitudes and issues that were in the atmosphere of the household environment as well. So, yeah, I think it's completely valid to say that, my family was sexually dysfunctional, which sounds really bizarre and really strange, but I think people would relate to that. I don't know. Comment if you relate to that. It's kind of a really weird thing to be like talking about, and it feels very, I don't know, it feels taboo. I feel like maybe I'm a crazy person talking about this. But, your body knows what it knows, and you notice things and you pick up on frequencies, and oftentimes you're not wrong. There's something going on there. What's that about? But certainly in the case of my family, it was an incredibly prudish and socially conservative environment as well. Sex was always taboo, always discouraged, always frowned upon, always mocked and insulted and desecrated or degraded in a lot of ways, through things that were said, jokes that were made. But like I say, there was always that push-pull thing. So it was like, on the one hand, you would receive this great deal of condemnation about, and feelings of sort of, shame around sex, but then at the same time you'd also be poked fun at for not having a girlfriend. How you get, when are you going to get a girlfriend? My situation was always like, well, I don't know how those things square away, and particularly given how I was raised, where I was an only child in a very strict household and sent to a single-sex school and had no cousins or anything. There was no mixing with the opposite sex anyway, so I was always quite perplexed as to how that would all work anyway. I remember my grandmother teasing me about sort of not having a girlfriend, and I'm thinking, but you're always ridiculing sex, and second of all, how would I meet a girl? Like, this is actually impossible from, given my circumstances. So the shame was sort of double, and the shame went in both directions. The shame went for, you were shamed for having and for not having. You were shamed for wanting and for not wanting, so you were ashamed for having any kind of like sexual intuition or feeling or thought, but then you were also shamed for not having that as an active part of your life. So you really couldn't win. It was this bizarre kind of world of shame, and that atmosphere of shame and repression, growing up through it and maturing through that, going through puberty in an environment like that. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty it's pretty traumatic, and it has a lasting effect. Certainly, there are those areas of your life, whether it's the interpersonal relationships, is it any wonder that if you were to grow up in an environment like that, that you would really struggle in that part of your life? And I mean, the answer is no. It's no surprise, but it is very embarrassing now, I think, looking back and coming to terms with that and making sense of it, because it's, again, I've talked about this before, but vulnerability, doing this whole project and looking back and sort of looking at what that atmosphere was like. And it's one thing to look at it and to acknowledge what it is, but then to accept that it had the effect that it did, it's painful. It's embarrassing, and it's tough to do. So, that's the latest thing. But yes, the title of this video, whatever I've titled it, my family was sexually dysfunctional. It was, I know that to be true, So, wow, that's a weird thing to say, and I feel like I'm really sticking my neck out there saying this today, but that's what I'm saying, and I'm sticking to it. It's definitely my true opinion. So if you find that kind of thing interesting, then you'll find the Barrow Podcast interesting. You can find links and further information in the description to today's video, as well as on the homepage to this YouTube channel. Please come and check it out. As always, if you find this relatable, and God forbid that you do, I feel sorry for you if you do, but if you do, or there's something you want to share, then feel free to comment, and yeah, I'll catch you on the next one. Bye.